Chapter 29 of A Short Life of Abraham Lincoln. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Allison Hester of Athens, Georgia. A Short Life of Abraham Lincoln by John G. Nicolay. Chapter 29. Sherman's Meridian Expedition. Capture of Atlanta. Hood supersedes Johnston. Hood's invasion of Tennessee. Franklin and Nashville. Sherman's march to the sea. Capture of Savannah. Sherman to Lincoln. Lincoln to Sherman. Sherman's march through the Carolinas. The burning of Charleston and Columbia. Arrival at Goldsboro. Junction with Schofield. Visit to Grant. While Grant was making his marches, fighting his battles, and carrying on his siege operations in Virginia, Sherman in the West was performing the task assigned to him by his chief to pursue, destroy, or capture the principal Western Confederate army, now commanded by General Johnston. The forces which under Bragg had been defeated in the previous autumn at Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge had halted as soon as pursuit ceased, and remained in winter quarters at and about Dalton, only 28 or 30 miles on the railroad southeast of Chattanooga, where their new commander, Johnston, had, in the spring of 1864, about 68,000 men with which to oppose the Union advance. A few preliminary campaigns and expeditions in the West need not here be detailed, as they were not decisive. One, however, led by Sherman himself from Vicksburg to Meridian, must be mentioned, since, during the month of February, it destroyed about 100 miles of the several railroads centering at the latter place, and rendered the whole railroad system of Mississippi practically useless to the Confederates, thus contributing essentially to the success of his future operations. Sherman prepared himself by uniting at Chattanooga the best material of the three Union armies, that of the Cumberland, that of the Tennessee, and that of the Ohio, forming a force of nearly 100,000 men with 254 guns. They were seasoned veterans, whom 3 years of campaigning had taught how to endure every privation and avail themselves of every resource. They were provided with every essential supply, but carried with them not a pound of useless baggage or impedimenta that could retard the rapidity of their movements. Sherman had received no specific instructions from Grant, except to fight the enemy and damage the war resources of the South. But the situation before him clearly indicated the city of Atlanta, Georgia, as his first objective, and as his necessary route, the railroad leading thither from Chattanooga. It was obviously a difficult line of approach, for it traversed a belt of the Alleghanies 40 miles in width, and in addition to the natural obstacles they presented, the Confederate commander, anticipating his movement, had prepared elaborate defensive works at the several most available points. As agreed upon with Grant, Sherman began his march on May 5, 1864, the day following that on which Grant entered upon his wilderness campaign in Virginia. These pages do not afford space to describe his progress. It is enough to say that with his double numbers he pursued the policy of making strong demonstrations in front, with effective flank movements to threaten the railroad in the Confederate rear, by which means he forced back the enemy successively from point to point until by the middle of July he was in the vicinity of Atlanta, having during his advance made only one serious front attack, in which he met a costly repulse. His progress was by no means one of mere strategical maneuver. Sherman says that during the month of May, across nearly 100 miles of as difficult country as was ever fought over by the civilized armies, the fighting was continuous, almost daily, among trees and bushes, on ground where one could rarely see 100 yards ahead. However skillful and meritorious may have been the retreat into which Johnston had been forced, It was so unwelcome to the Richmond authorities and damaging to the Confederate cause that about the middle of July Jefferson Davis relieved him, and appointed one of his corps commanders, General J.B. Hood, in his place, whose personal qualities and free criticism of his superior led them to expect a change from a defensive to an aggressive campaign. Responding to this expectation, Hood almost immediately took the offensive and made vigorous attacks on the Union positions, but met disastrous repulse and found himself fully occupied in guarding the defenses of Atlanta. For some weeks each army tried ineffectual methods to seize the other's railroad communications, but toward the end of August Sherman's flank movements gained such a hold of the Macon Railroad at Jonesboro, 25 miles south of Atlanta, as to endanger Hood's security, and when, in addition, a detachment sent to dislodge Sherman was defeated, Hood had no alternative but to order an evacuation. On September 3d, Sherman telegraphed to Washington, "Atlanta is ours, and fairly won. Since May 5th we have been in one constant battle or skirmish, and need rest." The fall of Atlanta was a heavy blow to the Confederates. They had, during the war, transformed it into a city of mills, foundries, and workshops, from which they drew supplies, ammunition, and equipments, and upon which they depended largely for the manufacture and repair of arms. But perhaps even more important than the military damage to the South resulting from its capture was its effect upon Northern politics. Until then, the presidential campaign in progress throughout the free states was thought by many to involve fluctuating chances under the heavy losses and apparently slow progress of both Eastern and Western armies. But the capture of Atlanta instantly infused new zeal and confidence among the Union voters, and from that time onward the reelection of Mr. Lincoln was placed beyond reasonable doubt. Sherman personally entered the city on September 8th and took prompt measures to turn it into a purely military post. He occupied only the inner line of its formidable defenses, but so strengthened them as to make the place practically impregnable. He proceeded at once to remove all its non-combatant inhabitants with their effects, arranging a truce with Hood, under which he furnished transportation to the South for all those whose sympathies were with the Confederate cause, and sent to the North those who preferred that destination. Hood raised a great outcry against what he called such barbarity and cruelty, but Sherman replied that war is war, and if the rebel families wanted peace, they and their relatives must stop fighting. "God will judge us in due time, and he will pronounce whether it be more humane to fight with a town full of women and the families of a brave people at our back, or to remove them in time to places of safety among their own friends and people." Up to his occupation of Atlanta, Sherman's further plans had neither been arranged by Grant nor determined by himself, and for a while remained somewhat undecided. For the time being he was perfectly secure in the new stronghold he had captured and completed, but his supplies depended upon a line of about 120 miles of railroad from Atlanta to Chattanooga, and very near 150 miles more from Chattanooga to Nashville. Hood, held at bay at Lovejoy's Station, was not strong enough to venture a direct attack or undertake a siege, but chose the more feasible policy of operating systematically against Sherman's long line of communications. In the course of some weeks both sides grew weary of the mere waste of time and military strength consumed in attacking and defending railroad stations, and interrupting and reestablishing the regularities of provision trains. Toward the end of September, Jefferson Davis visited Hood, and in rearranging some army assignments, united Hood's and an adjoining Confederate department under the command of Beauregard, partly with a view to adding the counsels of the latter to the always energetic and bold, but sometimes rash military judgment of Hood. Between these two, Hood's eccentric and